Welcome. I'm Jo-Ann McArthur, President and founder of Nourish Food Marketing, and I'm here on behalf of FCC, Fisheries Council of Canada, to talk about Canadian trends in fish and seafood. But first, I want to tell you just a quick bit about Nourish. So I like to say that we're an agency that knows a lot about a little. So don't ask us to tell you how to sell insurance. All we do is work with people in the food and beverage space. So we have the privilege to work with clients across the entire food ecosystem. So producers, processors, manufacturers, food service retailers, not-for-profits associations. And so what it does is it allows us to have a real holistic 360 view of the food and beverage landscape and the trends. So I'm going to talk about, in the second half of my speech, a little bit about protein trends that need to be on your radar right now. But first, I want to tell you a bit of a research story about fish and seafood. And we know that over really the past 10 years, there's been a real trend to consumers eating more protein. Protein's been a real hot button. However, fish and seafood have not participated in that trend. So why is that? What can we do about that? And there's a saying, I think it was JFK who first said it, the rising tide lifts all boats. And so what happened was the Fisheries Council of Canada, as well as the Canadian Aquaculture Industry Alliance, came together to solve this issue. So for the first time, you're having the folks who are on the wild caught side, as well as those who are on the farm side, working together. And what they hired us to do with this research was to figure out how to raise the profile of Canadian fish and seafood and build trust as a way to sell more fish, more Canadian fish to Canadians. And so there were really 3 stages to the research. The first was really getting the fact base, just an understanding of how often Canadians actually ate fish and seafood, who they were, and so I call that sort of the fact base. Then we wanted to understand, what was stopping them from eating more fish and seafood, and how could we overcome those barriers? And then the third stage was really testing out with a target group what were those collection of words, messages, positionings that could actually move them to action. So 3 stages of the research. I'm going to give you the highlights, and I'm going to spend more time on the first and second stage because the third stage, there's a lot of proprietary information in there. And of course, if you are a member of the FCC and you want to get more information on the research, please reach out to them because it is free for those members. So stage 1, figuring out the fact base. And so what we did was we went to a syndicated research study. So this is a study that's ongoing. They're actually surveying people daily called Ipsos 5. And it is the richest information of food behavior in Canada. They talk to 20,000 Canadians and they capture everything that they eat and drink, whether they make it at home, whether they summon it from outside of the home. So it's a really rich source of data to mine. And I'm going to give you the highlights and then I'll dive into the details a little bit more. But what we saw was that the fish and seafood protein, it's been flat for a very long time, even though, as I mentioned, there's been that trend in an increase in protein. So you're not getting your fair share. And this is especially concerning when you look at the rise in flexitarianism, the move away from red meat, and as well as we've seen a change in Canada's food guide, which is recommending eating more fish. And so you're not benefiting from those trends. And I know going into this research, there was a hypothesis that if we could build trust in seafood, we could grow the amount we sold. But what we found was actually it's about familiarity. Trust may be an issue 3 to 5 years down the road, but right now you're not even in their protein decision set in a way that you need to be. So the first issue is familiarity. Trust down the road will be important. And so the other thing that we saw was don't focus on baby boomers. You'll see as I take you through the information, you have them already. They are all in. They love fish and seafood. It's that next generation consumer that you really need to start focusing on as a way of future-proofing your business. And as I mentioned, you can see in these charts, fish and seafood has remained flat since 2016. We went as far back as 2016 when this research was first gathering data about how and what consumers ate. And you can see that you're a very small part of that protein set that consumers consume. And again, if you look at your per capita eat rates, the average Canadian is eating fish or seafood 60 times a year, which means about 5 times a month. And even if we look at your most popular fish or seafood item, which is salmon by far, that has remained flat as well since 2016. We then started to look at different age groups. And if you look at that gray bar, you can see I mentioned that those boomers, they are overdeveloped for fish and seafood. They understand you, they like what you offer, they're all in. What's concerning is if you look at the bars to the left, and that's your future market. That's who you need to be growing with because those boomers will age out of the market. So you really need to start focusing on that future consumer and getting those gray bars up a little more. We also cut the data a few other ways. We looked at household income. We looked at life status of the seafood eater. And again, what we saw was there's an inverse relationship between household income and consumption, which is perhaps a little less intuitive. And we see that when you look at those empty nesters on the right, again, that's largely baby boomers, they are overdeveloped. But it's those young families, it's those millennials who haven't started building their families yet that are not participating in your category the way they should be. We then looked at who's affecting purchase and how is the decision to purchase fish and seafood, how does that actually happen? And you can see that it tends to be more of a joint decision than other proteins. It tends to be made perhaps as a couple or as a family. And we also know that with proteins, they tend to be more of a planned purchase overall. You may, when you go grocery shopping, you may grab that other parts of the plate or a bowl, what looks fresh, but the actual protein in a meal and in your weekly shop tends to be more planned than other things. So it's really important to get on that shopping list and into that meal rotation. And we can see that, you know, how important kids are because kids in families have a large say on what the meals are and how and what gets purchased. So we really want to start focusing on that group. That's what the research is telling us. So we stepped back at the end of this stage and we said, okay, so what's the key challenge that we need to tackle? And it's about getting fish and seafood to be a little more family friendly and simple. You want to get into your grocery list, as I mentioned, into their meal rotation. We know that seafood has that health halo, but we want to make sure it's not seen as too functional, and we want to get consumers over that intimidation factor. And we also know that fish and seafood, they don't participate the way other proteins do in other meal occasions. So they tend to be more for dinner rather than for breakfast or for lunch. There's been a trend to snacking. That's not an area where you tend to participate. Home meal replacements, meal kits, not as much. So again, we want to focus on that a little more. We know that retailers also have focused on the fresh fish counter. They've invested a lot of money in there because they know through their own checkout data that those consumers that buy fish and seafood have an overall bigger basket ring. So when they check out, they're worth more money to that retailer. So they really have been focusing on bringing those people in, and they've been elevating that section. And I'm going to circle back to that in stage 2, what we learned a little bit about that as well. We also know that millennials are time pressed, especially those who, 2 careers, starting to have families. And with that, we have seen a resurgence in the frozen food aisle. I should preface that all of this research was done pre-COVID. I'll talk to that, what some post-COVID trends are as well after this. But even in a pre-COVID world, frozen food was starting to really, after years of being flat, it was starting to grow again. And it was really being driven by this millennial consumer because it's just convenient. And so when we went into the stores and started looking at the frozen sections, there have been a lot of new meals created that can basically get from freezer to table in under 30 minutes, which is a real hot button for consumers, that 30-minute. And yet when you look at the packaging of these new entrees, there's nothing calling that out at the front. So perhaps that's a reason why we're not seeing that be moving as quickly as it should. And of course, you have a real challenge in the frozen food aisle because you're also selling behind glass. So you really need to be clear on calling out. The other thing, as I mentioned, you've been flat for quite a while. You're not getting your fair share that you should be. You should be growing faster, frankly, than most other proteins. And as I said, we went into this with a hypothesis that it was about trust. It's not, it's about familiarity. So just talking about origin and trust, it's too early. You need to get them into the tent and buying your protein and becoming part of their decision set first, then you can move on there. And with flexitarianism on the rise, is there an opportunity to position yourself as a healthy protein option to get into that meal rotation? And we saw the need to focus on families and that next generation consumer because you have those baby boomers already. They're all in. So that was what we saw in stage 1. So really mining the fact base using an existing research panel out there. The second stage was to go in with some proprietary questions. And what we really wanted to understand here was, what are the barriers? What are stopping consumers from eating more fish and seafood? And also, what are some of the possible ways to get them over those barriers and changing their behavior? And, once we learn that, we would be able to start building that marketing strategy, that advertising that can actually move those attitudes to action. And so we talked to 2,000 adult Canadians across Canada, and we had some proprietary questions. And we started with an open-ended question. So we let consumers actually complete the question, I would eat more fish or seafood if. And they told us, and we put all those 2,000 answers together, but we wanted to ask them in an open-ended way first so that there was no bias around that. And then we gave them a drop-down menu where they could also choose all the other reasons why. And then we forced them to choose just one. What was the most important? And we did that as well when we asked them what factors could influence them to eat more fish and seafood. And again, what we saw, and it's always good when your second research confirms what you saw in the first research. So it says, everything's good, you're on the right track. So again, we saw the same consumption patterns, the fact that it increases with age, consumption of your category, and that we really needed to focus on those younger consumers. And then we cut the answers down by generation because we're already starting to hone in. We know that we want to talk to some of those younger consumers, those Gen Z, millennials, people with young families. And here we started to see too expensive starting to creep in. And I know a lot of people will say, well, don't you always get that answer when you ask consumers? The answer is yes, but not to the degree that we saw here. This was really coming through loud and clear. When we asked them what would get them over that hurdle, the top reason was better priced options. And that was by a huge amount. It was more than double the next answer, which was sourced from Canada label. So that was when they were forced to pick just one. And then other things that they talked about was easy to prepare. Again, when you really force them to choose, that started to pop up a little bit more. So now we've gone and we're cutting the data, you can see by how often they eat fish or seafood in a month. And why is that important? Well, if you think about who we want to target, do we want to talk to people who aren't seafood positive? It's going to take a lot of money and time to get those people to become what I call seafood positive. It's going to be much easier to focus on those people who are eating you 1 or 2 times a month and move them along to rather 1 to 2, move them to that 3 to 4. And here we're starting to see, again, they make up at least a quarter. So if you take those 1 to 2, 3 to 4, that's about half of all Canadians. So that's a good group to focus on. I would say that's kind of critical mass, and you can really make a difference to how much fish and seafood that you're ultimately selling. So when we're focusing on those people and you look at the top 5 reasons why, now you're starting to see a few other things bubble up. So better priced options, still number 1 for both those groups, but now we're starting to see easier to prepare and source from Canada labeling starting to bubble up. So that's something that we can work with. And so what we know from this first 2 stages now, we're starting to define who our targets are, those young families, those young adults, and by other pieces of data that we received in the research, we know that they're largely urban, suburban, and we know a little bit about their shopping behavior. And so here we've now figured out it's about familiarity, it's not trust. And something else I want to talk about, because we saw that whole expensive thing come up a lot. And, price is not the same as value. And what value is, it's really a perception by a consumer about what a product is worth. And so what we need to do is show them how you compare to other proteins from a value standpoint. And if you think about it, think about blueberries. I always think blueberries are an excellent example here because they are not cheap. And if you'd asked a consumer 10 years ago, they would have said blueberries very, very expensive. But blueberries are growing and they're on most people's grocery list now. And why is that? It's because they changed the conversation around price and value. They gave consumers a reason why they needed to eat more blueberries. And that was all around the whole antioxidant. But it changed that whole price value relationship for consumers. So that's what I mean when I talk about price and value. The great thing about Nourish, because we know a lot about little and we work across a number of categories, our clients like to say we're able to apply that Nourish secret sauce and apply some of the knowledge that we have from our other research and our work in other categories. And so what we looked at in terms of other proteins is if you look at what I call commodity meat protein, so no added value, beef and pork are actually down. So you're doing better than them. Where this added sales volume growth is that added value. And if you look at the deli meat category, if you look at that picture on the left, it might remind you a little bit of that seafood counter. And this is how deli category traditionally was. You had to point to what you wanted, it was sliced, and you walked away. And deli meat for years, flat, no growth. Now they are growing double digits. What changed? Well, they moved that one step along that convenience continuum. And they moved into pre-packaged, pre-sliced, out in the open in the bunkers where consumers naturally walk around. So a consumer could do self-service. And it also, they changed the conversation around convenience because they moved the consumer that one stage along what we call that convenience continuum that you can see here. So if you look at chicken, for example, whole chicken would be one thing, fresh, but you move it to added value if you've now seasoned it, if you've pre-cooked it and sliced it. Meal kits are the next thing, and then obviously ready to eat is further along meal continuum. I mention that because that also changes the consumer's view of price versus value. I said I was going to come back to the in-store seafood experience and how grocers had really focused on really making this a premium experience because they wanted to attract that consumer who they knew spent more money when they were in their store if they were a seafood purchaser. And in a way, it's kind of backfired. So this has worked well for the boomers of the world who are comfortable with fish, who don't find this intimidating. But for other consumers, it's actually gone the opposite way. It's actually reinforced how expensive potentially fish and seafood is because it looks very premium. You have to point to what you want. It's a lot of times it's kind of in what we call the ghetto of the grocery store, that far corner. It's not in the bunker with the other proteins, the other meat options to really appeal to those flexitarianisms. And there's also, you're not a homogeneous commodity like beef. Consumers can probably tell you what a serving of beef is, right? But it varies. How many scallops? If you have a whole fish, what does that mean in terms of serving size? So all of these things factor into that expensive equation for consumers and perception. So then we moved into positioning strategy. I'm not going to share a lot about what we did here, and I won't share the research here because it's proprietary. But it did focus on where you should focus your efforts, where's the biggest upside. You've already seen a lot of that. We created positioning statements by those key targets with ways of moving consumers over those perceived barriers, and also talking about what's best about you versus other proteins that are competitors to you. And then we did some key message development. So what are those key words, if you think about that big billboard, those 5 or 6 words that are really going to move a consumer to action to buy more Canadian seafood? And what are the supporting reasons to believe? So as I mentioned, our objectives: move people who are already seafood positive, they're already in the tent, move them over purchasing you a little bit more. And so what we needed to show them is that seafood's affordable, it's easy, it's fast to prepare, and get it into your regular meal rotation. We also needed to increase that understanding of what a portion size is for a healthy meal. As I said, that's a covert way of addressing the perceived cost. And we also know we need to tell the story of Canadian fish and seafood and instill pride in Canadians so that they buy Canadian first. And I'll talk about that trend a little more shortly. So again, we know who we're talking to. We did a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. What's best about you? And you can see this is a very big list, but we did some research to figure out what was the key point of difference that was most compelling for consumers when it was around seafood and fish, and what ultimately was going to get more Canadians to eat more Canadian seafood. So again, we're looking at who is our buyer persona. And we know that they tend to be university educated. We mentioned how often they consume seafood. They're going to be above average income. We know this is a premium product, and they live mostly in urban and suburban areas. So again, we want to move those seafood positive people over. We know as well that they often decide on what they're going to eat as a family or as a couple. And they're looking for those easy solutions where they can just add some fresh ingredients. Our other research has shown that there's actually the average family has 5 meals or recipes that they make on a continuous basis. So you need to somehow get into that meal rotation, and it's really tough to break into. And that's why there was such genius. You may recall that Taco Tuesday, how that's become a thing. And that was leveraging some existing behavior and getting into that meal rotation. And so with fish and seafood, you want to find an easy way to get in there. I'm not going to tell you how we solve that problem. Stay tuned. But we found a way to do that. And again, in terms of pain points, we know we need to get over that perceived value barrier, and also work around the intimidation factor a little bit, and the whole serving size discussion. So that's my research story about fish and seafood. Now I want to change gears a little bit and talk about some trends that were in our 2020 trend report that are applicable to protein and I think should be on your radar. And I mentioned we're food specialists. And one of the nice things about knowing a lot about a little is you can sometimes connect dots that other companies can't see. So we've been doing a trend report, I think it's 5 years. I've just listed the trends from the previous 3 years. And when I talk about trends, I'm not talking about fads. We don't come out and say the big flavor next year is going to be X, or, charcoal ice cream is going to be a big thing. That's a fad. What we're talking about are big societal shifts and how that's going to manifest itself in food and beverage. And you can see from our past 3 years, we've got a pretty good track record. The other thing I will say is we're not making any value statements about this. We work across all of food beverage categories. So what we're doing is just reporting on what we're seeing out there and what we think could happen. So we came out with our 2020 trend report in end of October, and it was looking great. And then that little COVID thing happened. And so it's not business as usual. And we've gone back and we've relooked those trends. And what happens in a pandemic is it's like gas on a fire. So some trends that we'd predicted are in a holding pattern or maybe have fallen off the table. But others, it's like gas on a fire. It's an accelerant. But first, what did we see with COVID? What happened? And overnight, you saw a huge shift from food service to grocery. So we had hit a point in Canada where more than 50% of our eating occasions were actually summoned from outside the home, whether it was takeout, delivery, home meal replacement, dining in. And overnight, that pivoted to 15%. And what we saw with fish and seafood was it was even more pronounced, because food service, the restaurants that were able to still kind of continue were the quick serve restaurants, the fast food restaurants, where you have lower participation rates. And the fine service restaurants were the ones that were most affected, where you're overrepresented. We also saw restaurants during this time, even the national chains, even a McDonald's, they started limiting the number of menu items that they were offering. And a lot of times you fell off the menu because you are maybe take a little longer to prepare, need a few more expert skills. And also that whole pivot to delivery fish does not necessarily travel as well when it's prepared. And so again, you suffered more than other proteins. Consumers had to start to cook again. They were dusting off their cookbooks. They were learning skills. We talked about how cooking had almost become a hobby, and it really changed. And at the start of the pandemic, we saw lots of pantry loading. So frozen canned seafood got a real hit, or a positive increase as consumers were getting things into their pantry. We also saw early in the pandemic, consumers were focusing on comfort foods. So meat sales at the start were really up. There's the saying that in extraordinary times, we reach for the ordinary. And that certainly is what we saw at the start of the pandemic. Consumers were drinking more as a way to cope, gaining more weight. The COVID-15 really is a thing. And we know that post-COVID, we are in recession, so there will be a squeeze. We do know that food prices will go up. So the question was, how do you capitalize on those new cooking at home behaviors while reassuring consumers that you don't need to be an expert, and position seafood as an everyday without reinforcing its perceived cost? What is your Taco Tuesday? What is your blueberry smoothie? How do you get into that meal, the meal rotation? And so, as I mentioned, with COVID, we're seeing some trends being amplified, and that real channel shift in terms of share of stomach, and also behavioral shifts. And the big question is, how much of this behavior will still be in place post-COVID? We know it takes minimum 3 weeks to develop a new habit. Well, we're now, over 6 months in. So some of this behavior is going to remain after the pandemic. We know that consumers are shopping very differently. There's been a move to online. Consumers are in shopping missions. They go in, they get out. There's less discovery of new products, less innovation, and consumers very mindful of what they're buying because they know largely it's got to last for 1 to 2 weeks because they're doing less top-ups. The number one increase activity over the pandemic has been cooking. This was a McKinsey Canada study. It's the number one thing. And often it's being done as a family. And we're also seeing there was a huge trend to snacking. And now we're going back to more traditional meal occasions, eating breakfast together as a family, eating lunch and dinner as a family. It's a way to break up the day. And also it gives the consumer a real sense of control, and we need control right now. We also know that food waste is becoming top of mind. If you're only able to shop so often, you want to make sure that you're using everything in your fridge. And that's another reason why fresh seafood at the start of the pandemic was not growing as quickly. And I mentioned, comfort foods, new routines, the whole quarantini, drinking more at the end of the day is a way of saying, okay, my workday is done, because everything's kind of blending into everything else. But now that we're over 6 months in here and consumers know that we could be in this for quite a while yet, we're seeing a refocusing on health. And so consumers know COVID is worse if you have an underlying condition. So there's a real focus right now on immunity health. And that's a big hot button, as well as more fresh, healthy foods. So one of the trends that we've seen accelerating, we believe, is what we called the Save Me trend. And we know before COVID, climate change was a hot button. And so we saw consumers starting to shift to what we call an environmental impact-based eating for the planet rather than just for health. But then COVID happened. And this is a picture of a wet market in China where apparently it started. And so there's even more discussion around this. And we've actually seen in Asia, where they're further ahead than we are in terms of time with this pandemic, we've seen plant-based eating really surge. And so this whole climatarian diet is at a tipping point, we believe, from environmentally to environmentally necessary from just aspirational. The other interesting thing is, for is for the first time in recent history anyway, the entire world is actually on the same side of an issue. We're all trying to beat COVID together. And so consumers are starting to feel a little optimistic about their ability to make an impact on climate as well, to repair some of the damage. And so sustainability is starting to go up in terms of the consumer mindset. Certainly some things like single-use plastics, where there'd been a real focus on pre-pandemic, that's gone by the wayside because it's all about personal safety right now. But there is this collective belief that if we work together, we actually can tackle this issue as well. And I mentioned at the start of the pandemic, comfort foods meat sales initially surged. Well, in Canada, we actually had to go to the US for some of our beef because we weren't able to process as much meat as we needed. And consumers, they've just always trusted that Canadian food system is safe, secure, plentiful. But for the first time, you walked into a store and you saw empty shelves. And that curtain between the consumer and the producer and processor fell. And so you can see, this is Google Trends. For the first time, you can see a spike. Consumers were starting to Google the topic meat processing, something that was never on their radar. So they were starting to rethink their relationship to meat. And we're starting to see more conversations about how meat's raised, how it's slaughtered, how it's processed, and what trade-offs are consumers willing to make, especially, as I mentioned, we're going into recession. And you are well positioned in terms of climate impact. You can see you are in the green in terms of a low impact food. So very well positioned in terms of a climatary diet. The picture on the below left is something that is just being launched in a chain called Just Salad. They have 40 locations. They're headquartered in New York City. And what they're doing is coming out with climatarian salads and products. And they're actually calling it out on their menu by giving a CO2 rating, which frankly isn't going to really mean a lot to a consumer, but they're putting it into context. So they are comparing everything to a quarter-pound patty of meat to show consumers the impact. So we're starting to see that happen as well. And we're also seeing a move to more sustainable animal proteins. This was happening even pre-pandemic. Consumers trading up to things like grass-fed, things that are a little less impactful on the climate. This is an Audubon certified beef out of the US called Blue Nest, and they raise the cattle in a way that the grasslands are protected and it's bird friendly. So Audubon has actually certified it. So we think we're going to start to see consumers moving up. And I should also mention, we're at a time where there are two Canadas during this pandemic. So we have some consumers who are just trying to make rent, having difficulty, food banks record high usage, but there's another half of Canada where they are actually have more discretionary income. They haven't had the same childcare costs. They aren't commuting as much. They haven't been able to eat out in expensive restaurants or travel. So you actually have a number of Canadians who are better off from a discretionary income standpoint. It's very polarizing, but those consumers are willing to trade up if it's for health or it's for planet. So you are, again, in a very good position there. The next trend I want to talk about is what we call Science Me, and it's related to protein as well. So we've seen over the past decade consumers moving away from processed foods. They want less processed food. They want more real food that's seen as healthy. And yet, with this whole plant-based protein trend, if you look at the ingredient lists, it's long. It's a processed product. And so, those consumers that moved to this for personal health rather than planet health, they're actually eating more of a processed food than perhaps they had originally. And so we know that consumers in some ways, GMOs they're not comfortable with. They may not know what that means, but they're worried about that. And so what we saw, starting with the ad you see on your left side, in the US, we started to see full-page ads by certain companies in the industry calling out the Beyond Meats of the world in terms of their ingredient list and whether it really was a healthy food or an ultra-processed food. Most recently, we saw on the right this letter, again, that was in newspapers from Light Life Foods, which is actually owned by Maple Leaf Foods, a great Canadian company who have actually changed their vision to be the most sustainable protein company in the world. Not meat protein, but just protein overall. So they took a page out of the playbook on the left, and they also tried to call out Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. It got into a bit of a fight in the gutter because then they came and started throwing rocks at the fact that, Light Life is, also is a processed food. So lots of discussion around that. But again, seafood and fish, you are one of those great green labeled foods. You're seeing even Chipotle talking about how they will never use these products in their food. And consumers actually have started Googling what is ultra processed, because we're seeing that a lot of studies are coming out. If you look at France, they are actually considering forcing companies to put ultra-processed food on their front label. So this is something that's coming. It may be on the back burner a little bit because there's a new appreciation with science. We all know that science is ultimately, hopefully, what's going to save us during this pandemic. But I do think that whole foods, healthy foods are the way forward here. And I have one final trend I want to talk about, and that is Nourish Me Locally. And so this was something that we saw growing before the pandemic, but now this is another one where, it's been an accelerant. And if you think about the last recession in 2008, farmers markets had been on the downturn. Some of them were going out of business, and then the recession hit. And now if you're trying to get into a farmer's market, if you're trying to get a place in a farmer's market, there's huge waiting lists. So what happened? Well, even though consumers were in recession, they wanted to support their neighbors, their community, whether they knew those people or not. It was a way of showing support. And we've done a lot of research around the term local. And it's interesting. I'm talking to you today from Toronto. And if you talk to somebody in Toronto, they will say that food grown in Vancouver is more local than food grown in Buffalo. Those borders are hard and they're hardening. And so local actually means Canadian and extends to that. And so what we're starting to see is with online shopping, that's one of those things that will probably, once things open up again, will consumers go back to shopping the way they did previously? Not to the same degree. So some of that online behavior, ordering, will continue. But we think it'll be more center of the store items because people actually love to grocery shop. It provides inspiration. And so we think that middle of the store things like toilet paper and flour, those kind of items, staple items, those will move online, but consumers will still go in and shop perimeter of the store. And that's where we think it's really important to tell those producer stories and put a face on your company, on your proteins. There's some really good research from CCFI, the Canadian Food Institute. They do an annual survey. And what they've shown is how disconnected Canadians are from their food supply. And that certainly was the case pre-pandemic. But I talked about how that veil has kind of fallen. And that veil was up there for a number of reasons. If I talk to people in the agricultural space, they really wanted consumers at arm's length. They did not want to invite them in. But again, you can see consumers are now Googling things like food supply. They want to know more about how their food is raised, caught. And the other thing we know from the CCFI research is if you look at who is most trusted, it's farmers, it's producers. They are right up there. When you look at the ranking of occupations that are trusted, they're right up there with doctors. So how can you, as a farmer, as a fisher, how can you tell your story? How can you invite consumers in, especially if you're not able to be in store with them? And how can you kind of encourage this radical transparency, which consumers are more and more wanting? And so I just want to show you two quick examples of companies outside of Canada that I think are doing a really smart job. This is a potato company out of Ireland. These brothers own a potato farm. And they've gone into added value processing. So they grow the potatoes that are actually in these potato chips. And if you turn around the back of the potato chip bag, you can actually find and go online and see the field where the potatoes that you just ate in the potato chips were raised. So does that make you feel better about that potato chip? Is it going to taste more wholesome and more delicious? Absolutely. Another company that's doing this in the US, Vital Farms. So you are able, when you buy those eggs, you can actually go in real time and see a picture of the chickens that laid those eggs and see the conditions that they're in. And it's going to make you feel better. That egg's going to taste fresher, and you're going to feel better about that egg as well. So lots of examples through QR codes, through websites of inviting consumers in. And so I think there's a real opportunity for your industry to buy Canadian, because right now, less than 30% of seafood consumed in Canada is Canadian. Talk about huge upside. And I think that there is a real opportunity to instill pride and trust in your industry by showing the people and the faces. Show the fishers, tell their stories, invite consumers in terms of how you catch, how you process. So I believe that's one of the key ways forward for any protein going forward. So this comes to the end of my discussion. Thank you so much. It's been a real privilege to speak to you. Thank you to Future Economy. Thank you to the FCC. If you want to learn more, you can hit that QR code, connect. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter, our past trend reports by going to our website, nourish.marketing. My email's there, and please link in with me. I would love to continue the conversation. Thank you.